We don't accept, first of all, such a threat coming from someone like Netanyahu, and he's calling about bring them to justice. He needs to be brought to justice. He's the one who's wanted to the ICC. That's number one. So I think that someone like him trying to lecture the world about the law, he's breaking every law. He broke every international law. He's starving people in Gaza. He's doing all these rogue actions in the entire region. What's next? What's next for him?
The events that unfolded in Doha sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of Qatar, altering the balance of power and exposing the fragile lines that separate diplomacy from destruction in the Middle East. For decades, Doha was considered untouchable, not because of its size or its military power, but because of its position as a diplomatic hub, a city where global powers converged, where peace talks were held, and where rival factions could sit across the same table under Qatar's careful mediation. When the strike happened, it shattered more than glass and steel. It shattered an illusion that the capital was safe from the flames of conflict. The attack struck near key areas in Doha, shaking the confidence of residents and exposing vulnerabilities that no one had expected. Israel justified its move by claiming that Qatar had allowed hostile actors to operate within its borders, providing support and safe haven to groups that threatened Israeli security. But for many, this justification was thin, a mask for a far more complex game. Netanyahu, facing political pressure at home, escalating conflict on multiple fronts, and an increasingly divided international audience, saw in Qatar both a symbolic and strategic target. By hitting Doha, he was sending a warning not only to Qatar, but to every state that dared challenge Israeli actions in the region. The world's immediate reaction was a mixture of shock and condemnation. International leaders scrambled to assess what the strike meant and whether it signaled the opening act of a much larger war. The United Nations called for restraint, while Washington walked a delicate line, torn between its alliance with Israel and its military partnership with Qatar, where American forces maintain one of their most important bases in the region at Al Udeid. European capitals expressed concern, warning that escalation in the Gulf would destabilize energy supplies and global markets. But Netanyahu's words after the strike took the situation to a new level. In a televised address, his voice firm and defiant, he declared that Israel had drawn a new red line, that any retaliation from Doha or from its allies would be met with force beyond anything seen before. The phrasing was deliberate, almost apocalyptic, designed not only to intimidate Qatar, but to warn Iran, Turkey, and even the Gulf Cooperation Council states that might rally behind Doha. The strike on Doha carried heavy symbolism. Qatar, despite its small size, has leveraged its wealth and diplomacy to become a global player. It hosted the World Cup, positioned itself as a mediator in conflicts from Afghanistan to Sudan, and built ties with both Washington and Tehran, with Ankara and Beijing. By attacking Qatar, Israel was not just hitting a target, it was challenging the very idea that small states could stand independent in a world of giants. For Qatar, the blow was personal, a violation of sovereignty and a public attempt to undermine its prestige. The residents of Doha, used to security and prosperity, suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of a geopolitical storm. Families rushed to stockpile essentials, embassies issued alerts, and the sense of vulnerability was palpable. Yet beneath the fear was also anger. Anger at being targeted, anger at the arrogance of Netanyahu's words, and anger at the implication that Qatar should cower in silence. Across the region, the attack was seen as a dangerous escalation. Arab leaders debated whether to condemn Israel outright, fearing retaliation, while Iran wasted no time in framing the strike as evidence of Israeli aggression that threatened the entire Muslim world. On social media, millions of voices rose in solidarity with Qatar, framing the attack as not only against Doha, but against Arab dignity itself. But amidst this storm of reactions, the key question loomed: how would Qatar's leadership respond? The Prime Minister, long known for his measured words and diplomatic balancing act, now faced the defining test of his career. To remain silent would be to signal weakness. To lash out militarily would risk total war. The world watched, waiting for his words, knowing that what he said next could either calm the storm or set the Middle East ablaze. When the Prime Minister of Qatar finally addressed the nation, the world leaned in. His speech was broadcast live across networks, his figure framed against the Qatari flag, his tone steady, deliberate, and firm. He began not with anger, but with clarity, stating that Qatar had been attacked unjustly, that innocent civilians had been put at risk, and that such an act represented not strength, but recklessness. He condemned Netanyahu's threat to be dangerous beyond measure, a statement that would only deepen instability in a region already balancing on the edge of ends. Yet his words were more than condemnation. They were a declaration of resilience. He spoke of Qatar's sovereignty, of its right to exist without intimidation, and of its refusal to bow to any state that sought to dictate its policies through violence. His voice, calm yet forceful, carried a message that resonated with citizens who had feared weakness but now heard defiance. He reminded the world of Qatar's role as a mediator, a state that had consistently worked for dialogue when others chose war. From hosting Afghan peace talks to negotiating humanitarian corridors, Qatar had built its identity on diplomacy. But he was clear that diplomacy was not submission. Our pursuit of peace, he said, is not a license for others to wage war upon us. Our calls for dialogue are not signs of weakness, and our silence should never be mistaken for surrender. These words echoed across the Arab world, drawing applause from allies and surprising even critics who had doubted Qatar's resolve. His speech also carried veiled warnings. Without naming specific states, he hinted that Qatar had powerful friends and strategic alliances that would not remain passive if the aggression continued. He mentioned the presence of American forces, the partnerships with Turkey, and the deep ties with regional actors, subtly reminding Israel that striking Doha was not a risk-free endeavor. The Prime Minister's response triggered waves across global politics. In Washington, policymakers found themselves caught in a storm. The U.S., reliant on both Israel as a key ally and Qatar as a critical base for its forces, realized that Netanyahu's aggression had cornered American diplomacy. To stand with Israel risked alienating Qatar, whose cooperation was essential for counterterrorism operations. To side with Qatar would fracture the U.S.-Israel relationship. Europe, meanwhile, welcomed the Prime Minister's words, urging restraint and calling for immediate negotiations. In the Arab world, his defiance was met with admiration. Street demonstrations in Amman, Cairo, and even parts of Riyadh held signs praising Qatar's stance, framing it as a defense of Arab sovereignty against unchecked aggression. Netanyahu, however, did not retreat. His government dismissed the speech as posturing, insisting that Israel would act again if its security was threatened. But behind closed doors, analysts in Tel Aviv debated whether the strike had gone too far, whether it had awakened a regional backlash that could turn global opinion against Israel at a time when it could least afford isolation. For Qatar, the speech marked a turning point. Its citizens, once shaken, now felt a renewed sense of unity. The Prime Minister's words galvanized them, turning fear into determination. It was a moment where leadership rose to meet crisis, where words became shields as powerful as weapons. The aftermath of the speech extended beyond rhetoric. Diplomats rushed to Doha, seeking to calm tensions and prevent escalation. Turkey pledged solidarity, Iran promised support, and even Gulf neighbors that had once clashed with Qatar during the blockade years signaled that sovereignty must be respected. The Prime Minister had managed not only to respond to Netanyahu's threat, but to turn it into an opportunity, rallying international sympathy and positioning Qatar as a small state standing bravely against intimidation. The battle of narratives had begun, and in that arena, Doha had won the first round. As the days unfolded, uncertainty lingered. Would Israel strike again? Would Qatar's allies intervene? Or would the situation freeze into another 10th stalemate in a region that knows too many such stories? Nobody could say for sure, but what was certain is that a line had been crossed, and that Qatar's Prime Minister had met that crossing with words that refused to bow, words that carried the weight of defiance, and the hope that even in the face of aggression, diplomacy could still be stronger than destruction. The world continues to watch, knowing that this confrontation between Netanyahu's threats and Qatar's defiance could either spark a larger fire or mark the beginning of a new resolve for peace in the Middle East.